A brief history of schools and education in the United States. The concept of education as we know it today really started with the Greeks. Some areas, like Sparta, emphasized training young men to fight and how to endure hardship, while others, like Athens, emphasized intellectual development. One thing early education efforts had in common was excluding females, slaves, and non-citizens. This pattern of limiting education to certain groups of people has lasted even through today, and that will be a deeper discussion for a future lesson. What we know as a liberal arts education, one that focuses on a wide variety of subjects rather than just one, like the Spartans or Athenians, began with a roving group of educators known as the Sophists, who taught rhetoric to whoever could pay the tuition. Now here's something interesting. Do you want to know who's responsible for making you sit through lecture in school? Well, look no further than Protagoras, a sophist, who pioneered the model of instruction that has become the standard everywhere. Listen to a lecture, do some homework, and then take a test. Yep, he's the guy to blame for beginning all of that. Now, if we're going to talk about the ancients and their impact on education, we definitely have to include Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates is known for teaching us how to draw out universal meaning from within by carefully questioning students with a seemingly endless "and why do you think that?" This form of questioning is what we refer to today as Socratic questioning. Now, Plato is a guy who founded a school known as the Academy, where he used his teacher Socrates as a primary character in his stories and lectures. Plato believed only the most intellectually accomplished should lead society, and that an organized educational system could prepare citizens to do so. Aristotle was one of Plato's students and founded an actual school which was called the Lyceum, a place where students and teachers could engage in vigorous discussion and debate. The Romans expanded these Greek notions of education, and their control of much of the world helped spread these ideas across Europe, Asia, and Africa. One thing you'll notice from this overview of the impact of the ancient Greeks and Romans is that there's no mention of influential women. Well, that was by design. Remember, women and many others were not allowed to receive an education or even lead the community. The next 1,000 years or so didn't result in much development in the way of a liberal arts education for all. After all, they didn't call this time the Dark Ages for nothing. But afterward, we did see a dramatic rise in the influence on the Catholic Church on organized education. From scholasticism to the establishment of universities, it was then that leaders began to really think about the value of education and how organized schooling could transform people's lives. This philosophy of emphasizing the value of education rather than just the transfer of skills and knowledge is known as humanism, and this came just in time for the Renaissance, which is considered one of the most flourishing times for creativity and thought. Okay, so let's move over to America. You probably already know that the religious group known as the Puritans immigrated from England to what was known back then as the New World. Can you guess what kind of education they wanted to institute once they arrived at the New World? That's right, Bible studies and religious indoctrination. Look, the Puritans had no intention of tolerating any other religion or spiritual movement, and they were going to make sure it stayed that way. Fun fact, one of the most famous fire and brimstone preachers of that time, who made a name for himself with his widely circulated "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" sermon, was Jonathan Edwards, who was the father of one of the founders of Princeton University, which still exists today, and was the grandfather of our third U.S. Vice President, Aaron Burr. That's right, the guy who killed Alexander Hamilton, who apparently threw away his shot. The point is, religion was, from the moment this nation was even considered, an integral part of organized schooling in America. That's partly why we still see the controversy we do, even though the Constitution protects its citizens from forced religious instruction in public schools. An important achievement in early American education was the Massachusetts Act of 1642, which led to what would become compulsory education, which means children would be required by law to attend school. Mind you though, this formal schooling usually only consisted of 3 or 4 years of elementary schooling, not like the 12 to 13 years that are required today. Remember how influential religion was in the days of the Puritans? Massachusetts also passed the Old Deluder Satan Act of 1647, which required most larger towns to establish a school and a teacher to educate children so that they could avoid the temptations of that old deluder Satan. Many of the students of the day learned from a textbook called the New England Primer, an illustrated textbook that included religious readings. Originally published in 1690, this textbook continued to be used for more than 100 years. Pretty quickly, regional and religious differences in schooling began to surface, with many other religious groups like the Quakers, Mennonites, Baptists, and others establishing their own privately funded parochial schools. Also, vocational schools began to emerge as manufacturing began to take hold in America. With all these new options, do remember there are still many who were excluded from compulsory education. This included persons of color, women, and children of those who held no land. Girls in wealthy families might have been able to receive a basic education, but the focus was more inclined toward them easing into a social life rather than for personal growth. In the 18th century, there was some progress toward universal education. President Thomas Jefferson sought more opportunities to educate children who were not part of the social elite, but not necessarily slaves. And Noah Webster published the Webster's American Spelling Book, which created a unified way to spell American English. This reference is the reason why Americans don't spell words like honor and color like the British. Despite the intention to unify Americans through a common language, Webster's work was also part of the ongoing effort to force English-only instruction in all schooling, which severely limited the education of Hispanic students in mission schools. It wasn't until 1968, with the Title VII of the landmark Elementary and Secondary Education Act, that schools were compelled to meet the needs of English language learners. Despite a smattering of schools supported by religious organizations, there still was no concerted effort to provide a universal education program to educate non-whites. The 19th century brought with it a new focus on educating Americans so they could better serve their communities and help support the newly formed republic. This utilitarian focus still included elements of religion because remember, the Puritan legacy was deeply entrenched in American society. During this time, the New England Primer was eventually replaced by the McGuffey Readers, which included messages of moral virtue and emphasized the value of hard work. The wave of immigration in the middle of the 19th century brought with it new ideas of how to teach and even how to care for children as they learned. In the late 1800s, immigrant families from Poland, Germany, Italy, Russia, and other countries were vigorously educated in the American cleanliness culture. Llewellyn Hoy wrote in Chasing Dirt, The American Pursuit of Cleanliness. Children's fingernails, hair, faces, and teeth were inspected for dirt, and they were taught how to properly wash up with soap and use toothpicks to scrape the dirt from under their nails. Teachers at overcrowded urban schools also worried about contagious disease and often quarantined kids with sniffles and other symptoms. In fact, the concept of caring for children as they learned was one of the ideas from German Friedrich Froebel, who introduced the idea of a caring, nurturing environment of open learning for children, a garden where children could grow. This kindergarten concept stressed early motor skills to help prepare them for the more difficult learning that was to come later. Pay close attention and you may note how many schools in your area are named after the educator Horace Mann. Well, that's because Mann is the person most known for championing the notion of public schools, which were earlier known as common schools, which were for all children and was behind the idea of establishing normal schools to prepare and educate future teachers. But let's remember, when we say all children, we're not really talking about all children. Schools were still excluding many, especially blacks and Native Americans. Many well-intentioned progressive educators did attempt to provide an education to non-white children, but these attempts were often met with a lack of funding and even violence. In many localities, the legal system sided with those who wanted to exclude non-white students. The concept of providing separate but equal was particularly prevalent in the South, with the passage of Jim Crow laws that essentially separated African Americans from mainstream society in virtually all aspects of life. these Jim Crow laws separating blacks from whites were upheld even by the Supreme Court in the case Plessy versus Ferguson and wasn't overturned until 60 years later in the case Brown versus Board of Education. Notable in this fight was W.E.B. Du Bois, a graduate of Harvard University and the first African American to receive a PhD in the United States, who founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was instrumental in seeking racial justice in education. In fact, Du Bois fought back against the idea that African Americans accept anything less than an equal place in society and campaigned for the education of the talented tenth among African Americans who would eventually become business and political leaders. The Morrill Act of 1862 provided a boost to higher education institutions by providing each state federal lands for use by colleges for the study of agricultural and mechanical arts. One of the more famous so-called land-grant colleges is Texas A&M, but there are also two in Arkansas, the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville and Pine Bluff. The government also provided resources to establish other colleges with specific focuses. The University of Central Arkansas is one of many schools that began as a normal school, an institution of higher education intended to educate and prepare teachers. Former slave Booker T. Washington was asked to lead one such normal school for African Americans, the Tuskegee Institute, and because of a lack of public support and funding, Washington and his students literally built the school and farmed the land for the school's funding. Did you know that the federal government actually does not require a formal education? The right to an education is found nowhere in the U.S. Constitution. So, the 10th Amendment says that any governmental role not specifically spelled out in the U.S. Constitution falls to individual states. This means each state has the responsibility to articulate the right to an education and is solely responsible for ensuring that that right to an education is achieved for all students, for all citizens. Any federal involvement, such as establishing protections for students of color, language minority students, and even females, or the providing of free and reduced school lunches, or identifying and addressing the educational requirements of special needs students, is done so by providing funds and resources to each state to ensure these priorities are met. Progressivists, those like John Dewey in the early 20th century, began to advance educational methods that focus more on the whole child rather than just skills to be learned. It was through this progressivist focus that classes in home economics, civics, and woodshop began to appear in the curriculum. Now, Dewey looked for a balance in the progressivist curriculum, one that focused on both academics and values. But the progressivist movement wanted to go further toward the effective focus on values and child-centered methods. If you've seen a Montessori school in your community, know that the students inside are being exposed to a curriculum that focuses on developmentally appropriate activities centered on learning through play, a method championed by Maria Montessori, an Italian physician of the early 20th century. Now, progressivism and its focus on play-based learning began to suffer a significant lack of popularity once the Soviet Union launched the first ever artificial satellite, Sputnik, into space in 1957. This was during the height of the Cold War, a time of extreme tension between the United States and the USSR, the latter of which crumbled in the early 1990s and is now what we know as Russia. So Americans were spooked, and they felt that we as a nation had gotten complacent and let those communist Soviets get the best of us in math and science. Here they were, conquering space while we're letting our kids play with blocks and finger paint. So the federal government's response was to prioritize billions of dollars into curriculum reform projects aimed at preparing the next generation of scientists and civic leaders. For many, this prioritization toward math and science and social studies was a matter of national defense. What also happened in the late 1950s was the landmark decision Brown versus Board of Education, which ended decades of legally sanctioned segregation based on race in schools. This was not an easy victory, and the subsequent difficulty in desegregating schools by race hit a flashpoint in the South, particularly in the stories of Ruby Bridges, who was a young elementary-age student who had to be escorted into the school by the police, and the Little Rock Nine, who were initially barred from entering Central High School by the Arkansas National Guard. This effort at desegregating schools led many white communities like Little Rock to shutter publicly funded schools or defy mandatory busing orders to open whites-only private schools. In 1971, businessman William Rector founded Pulaski Academy for those, he said, who, quote, don't like busing, and where the community could, quote, play Dixie if we want to without having a riot about it. Others flocked to nearby towns that were predominantly white and established schools there. This practice has come to be known as white flight. In 1965, perhaps the most consequential law for public education was passed. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act established provisions for funding programs aimed at disadvantaged children and their families. The ESEA has been reauthorized numerous times, and its focus shifted as society's priorities changed. Later, the ESEA was amended to include resources to address the needs and to protect the rights of language minority students. That's Title VII. And to prohibit discrimination based on sex. That was Title IX. And then later in 1975, PL 94-142, which mandated the providing of a free and appropriate education for all students, particularly for those with special needs. In the 1980s, a government report called A Nation at Risk was released, and it colored a bleak picture of where we were as an educated nation. The government outcry from this report led to a widespread increase in standardized testing and a further shift from a student-centered curriculum. This era has been called the accountability movement. In 2000, the ESEA became the No Child Left Behind Act, which ramped the accountability movement into high gear, instituting a reward and punishment system for schools based on student performance on standardized tests mandated in each state. In 2015, the No Child Left Behind Act became the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, which removed much of the punitive mandates in the earlier form of the law and gave states more autonomy in determining how best to use federal dollars and ensure accountability of educational reform efforts.